Welcome to the Craftsman Founder Podcast, hosted by Lucas Carlson. Every week, we talk to founders, entrepreneurs, and those who've made a craft out of creating companies and enterprises. Listen every week to get ideas for starting, promoting, and growing your business. There are no shortcuts, just good old-fashioned hard work and craft. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's interview.
Hello, this is Lucas Carlson from the Craftsman Founder blog, and today I am very excited to interview Eliot Peper, author of Uncommon Stock, and it's a really big pleasure for me because I'm also writing a novel, and Eliot has done this, and it's really exciting to be able to talk to somebody who is somebody who created the genre of the startup novel, and get a little perspective, how he came to it, what his background is, and understand better some of the challenges he faced and what's next for him. So, Eliot, welcome, and thank you for taking your time. Can you tell us about your background? What did you do before you wrote novels? For me, because I'm also writing a novel. And
some feedback there. There we go. Okay, well, Lucas, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure, and to be honest, I'm really excited to read your book when it comes out. You know, starting a new genre can only be done with a full team of people working around it, and I think there are a lot of people out there doing this stuff, and it's really exciting to see. My background is actually in working for startups. So right while I was in college, I started working for my first startup. They were doing plasma arc gasification technology. So that sounds like science fiction already, right? They're turning garbage into electricity. So that was a ton of fun, and I immediately fell in love with just the process of getting things moving and being creative and being entrepreneurial. And after that, I actually co-founded a company with 3 friends, and we were advising clean technology companies on market entry into Latin America, and it was a fantastic experience. You know, we had a wonderful time with it, and we worked with a number of really interesting clients, ranging from battery startups all the way up to one of the top 10 global solar firms. And then after that, actually, all of us got recruited away at the same time, which was quite fun. My co-founders, including my wife, were recruited into some large engineering and architecture and environmental firms, and I was recruited out to work for a seed venture capital firm as an entrepreneur in residence. So that involved basically like doing a lot of what I loved, which was basically working with all their different portfolio companies, so a bunch of different startups as a drop-in operator and advisor. So sort of, trying to figure out what the key next steps and milestones for growing the businesses were, and helping them get past that next big obstacle. And so so I've always loved that kind of work, and now I actually still do that same kind of work independently. So I advise and consult with a few different really high-performing technology startups, which is quite a bit of fun. I just like working with entrepreneurs because it's just a great mindset to have about the world, right? And I write, so that's what sort of brought us here today.
Yeah, so how did you get into writing? What brought you to that? Sure,
yeah. So I love stories. Like, I've always loved stories, actually. So like even when I was a little kid, I remember, so my mother is from Vancouver, Canada, and during the summer we would always do a road trip up to visit my family in Vancouver. And for those of you who haven't driven from Oakland to Vancouver, it's 2 days of 10 hours a day in the car, right? And but my parents were pretty sneaky, and they hooked me up with like a little Walkman, right? And I got books on tape, like from the library, or I would and I would have these books on tape, and I would sit in the back of the car. I remember I always had it was a minivan, and I would sit in the farthest seat from the front, like way in the back in the corner, and I would just sit there all day, staring out the window, like listening to these stories, right? And I was like always we'd stop for lunch, and I was like eager to get back in the car, right? Like, come on. And so I've always loved stories, and because of that, I've always been a voracious reader. And one of the things that I noticed in the startup world and in the business world is just that there's so much inherent drama there, right? Like there's so, like, you have these big personalities. You have people who are really driven, really trying to pursue their passion. People screw each other over. Things go wrong. Like teams explode, friendships burn to the ground, and then on the other side of it, you have these massive successes, right? And there's so much going on. There's so many strong relationships are built there, and it's a magical, wonderful, exciting world. And because I'm a voracious reader, I wanted to read about it, and it turns out that there's like a ton of good nonfiction about business and entrepreneurship and startups. There's just like mountains of it, really, really good stuff. A lot of really bad stuff too, right? But you could fill a library with it. But what I couldn't find and what I wanted to read was like fiction set up in the startup world, right? So like adventures about entrepreneurship that sort of introduce people to it. And my thinking was that, like, if John Grisham can make law exciting, right, like through these adventure stories, why couldn't that be the same for tech and for startups? And because I had such a hard time finding that story to read, I decided, well, maybe I'll try my hand at writing it. Maybe I'm not the only one who wants to read that stuff, right? So that's how I started writing Uncommon Stock.
And so, great. That sounds awesome. Tell us about Uncommon Stock. What's the story?
So I actually have the first and so far only physical copy in existence right here, right now. So
wow.
It's the proof copy from the printer. So we actually just got it, approved through. We're using Lightning Source. So now they just put their stamp of approval on it, and so it'll be available. The physical copy will be available to the world very soon here. But it's an adventure story set in the startup world. So it's about two co-founders. They live in Boulder, Colorado, and they're both college students at CU Boulder. And they end up dropping out of school to start a new software company. And their company is called Mosaic, and it has a set of algorithms that essentially allow you to uncover fraud or unusual things in financial data. So you can sort of take their piece of their product, run a bunch of financial data through it, and you'll have all these red flags come out the back that might indicate that your accountant's made a mistake, or it might indicate that there's something really fraudulent going on, and it might be illegal, right? And so they end up getting caught up in this whirlwind of sort of money laundering cartels right as they're trying to raise their initial seed financing round to get their startup off the ground. So it just sort of it devolves from there.
That's so fun. Actually, I wanted to show you something, because when I started reading the novel, I got really excited because one of the co-founders, his passion is one of my passions. I want to show you something really quick.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, so this is my Go board, and
that's awesome.
I've been playing Go for a very long time, and one of the founders in your book plays Go. And
yeah.
I just at that point I fell in love. So
that is so cool. That is so.
Yeah. There are very few books written about Go. There are a few, and there are a few fiction ones, and I've read them. But I was excited that it was a startup novel and a Go novel. Not a ton of Go, but enough to make me happy.
I think, yeah, it should have had more. Yeah, I mean, I find Go fascinating. I mean, it's such, I feel like it really accesses so much of that sort of like pure strategic thinking around pattern recognition, and it's really, really a fascinating game, and I think there's so much rich opportunity for metaphor there.
Yeah. So let's bring this back to startups. How is writing a novel like doing a startup?
You know, it's actually really similar. You know, I've thought about that quite a bit, and like, so when you write a book, it's a product. I mean, that's what you're building, right? So I mean, some people sit down and write code, and some people sit down and write English, right, or some other language, right? And so in the beginning, especially in the very beginning, I feel like that's where a lot of the big crossovers are, right? Because you have to work on product, but at the same time, like, being, at least in my view, the kind of writer that I want to be, there are different kinds of authors, right? And like the author I want to be is I want to be a storyteller around a fire, right? Like, and I feel like there's actually a lot happening right now in the world of publishing, in the world of technology, in the future of storytelling that's bringing us back to our roots, right? We sort of had this interesting piece in the 20th century where it's like, oh, you can just sort of be off in a cabin and ship your manuscript to a publisher and that's it. But like now, I feel like being a writer is much more like being an entrepreneur, and writing a novel is much more like doing a startup, because you have to build a community of people that get into what you're writing, right? Like your readers, your fans, and those start with your friends and your colleagues. And so it's all about building a community and then telling stories that are worth telling, right? I mean, there's so many jokes now about how many bazillions of new apps there are, right? And how many of them might not have the utility that their founders expect them to. But you know, ultimately, the same is true for content, right? Like the key to making a good product is to make something worth using, right? Like, I mean, like that's really, when you get down to it, that's your MVP. That's what you really need to do. And the same is true with a story. If you're going to craft a story, just like, I mean, your site is called Craftsman Founder, right? And I think that actually exemplifies the way of thinking behind that, right? It's like when you're crafting a story, you need to write a story that's worth reading. Otherwise, you're wasting your own time and everyone else's. So I feel like that kind of thinking, there's a ton of crossover between the two.
Yeah, that makes total sense. One of the reasons that I fell in love with the idea of writing a novel was also very similar to you. I realized that as a startup founder, as a CEO, pretty much 95% of your job is actually storytelling. Mm-hmm. And right. You're telling stories to investors, you're telling stories to your employees, you're telling stories to your partners, you're telling stories to your customers. And if you don't realize that you're telling stories, you're still telling stories. Right. Whether you realize it or not, you're just not putting an effort behind it, crafting the stories that you're telling, you're just letting them come. But when you actually realize that your job as a founder and CEO is storytelling and put an effort behind it, it can actually create some structure to your job as a founder. It's very fascinating. It intrigues me to no end.
I couldn't agree more. I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think that storytelling is the requisite skill for being a founder or a leader of any kind, but like especially a founder, because you have all those different audiences that you just listed that like those are the people you're telling stories to all day long. You know, there's a great quote, and I actually don't remember who said it, and I'm going to butcher it, I'm sure, but it was in like the 17th or 18th century, and it was about how, you know, in order to be a great explorer, right? So now we're talking like you're going to be like Captain Cook, right? So like in order to be a great seafaring explorer, you know, you don't need to know how to like weave a sail or make a rope or even do construction for the ship, right? Or cook or avoid scurvy or navigate. You don't need to know any of those things. The only thing you need to be able to do is share your love for the sea, right? And that's what allows you to empower all of the people around you that have those specific expertise that you need in order to discover the new continent, right? And I think that applies 100% to any startup company, right? Like that's what founders need to be doing.
I love that, because I agree. I've seen so many people take like a micromanaging approach to founding a company. Well, I need to know exactly how to deal with term sheets, and I want to know every little term, and that's what lawyers are for. I want to know all about payroll and figure out all the that's you have people in operations that can do that. You can outsource, you can trust a team, there's so much work, and I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs get so busy in the details that they lose the sight that they're the captain, and the captain's job isn't to implement the details. The captain's job is to guide the ship, and it's very fascinating. I love the way you think. So, how does an author promote and do marketing for his work? A lot of entrepreneurs, one of their problems is nobody knows about their startup, and and same for a first-time author. Nobody knows about your book and your writing. So there's a lot of interesting parallels there. How does an author go ahead and try to create an audience?
Yeah, and there are some really fascinating parallels there, and I actually think that authors, like, the more that I've done both now, the more that I realize that, like, authors just are entrepreneurs, and sometimes vice versa, right? Like, and there's really, like, the divisions between them just disappear more and more and more. And that's absolutely true once you're launching your product, right? Which is, once you're launching your book. And I think that there are a few lessons that I've learned going through the process, and that I see other people doing that sometimes you're like, that you almost want to be able to share with them. One is the first key to, like, good marketing of any kind, but particularly good marketing when, like, I'm a first-time author or when you're launching your first product, is you need to make a damn good product, right? Like, the best marketing you can have is just making something that's good enough that other people will recommend it to their friends organically. And I feel like, if anything, that's even more true for books. Because if you think there are a lot of new startup companies being launched every day, like, guess how many books are being launched every day, right? I mean, it's just this maelstrom of new titles that are launching constantly that it's very difficult to rise above the noise. And so it's a challenge. And so the first thing is, if you haven't written something that's awesome, and it's not just your writing that is important, like, I don't have any, like, delusions of grandeur. Like, this is my first book, and writing is a craft, and it can take, authors of fiction often say that it takes, like, you hit your stride after you hit about 1 million published words. So it's sort of like Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours, right? And so this, Uncommon Stock has 70,000 words. So I'm getting started, but I'm I'm gonna have to release another 10 books before I get there. And so you have to be honest with yourself and humble about how you present it. But, like, you need to do your best to make it as good as it can possibly be, and that means, whether you're self-publishing, publishing with a small press, or traditionally publishing, it means taking every ounce of effort and devoting it not only towards the creative process, but also taking editorial extremely seriously, taking cover design seriously, like taking every component and making sure that it's awesome, that it'll delight whoever picks it up or whoever downloads it off Amazon. And so I'd say that's the first trick to marketing, is, like, make something that's worth reading. The second thing is, like, it would be one thing if I was, like, a billionaire and I launched a book and I knew I wanted to be, like, a New York Times #1 bestseller, so I could sort of, like, buy my way into as much marketing as I possibly could, and at least, if nothing else, I'm going to have a nice big huge pop at the beginning, right? Like, because I can buy billboards and TV ads in addition to like every other kind of marketing you can imagine. But I don't have that. I'm, this is actually the lead title for FG Press, which is a new publishing company based in Boulder, and I'm a first-time author, and I'm not a billionaire, so I don't have that option, right? And I don't think that I would want that option. Like, even if I had $1 billion, that's not what I would be spending it on. And but it is interesting because you still have to engage with people, right? And it turns out that even for those people who spend boatloads of money promoting their books, usually those boatloads of money have a very limited utility in terms of time. You can definitely pay to be on the New York Times bestseller list for a month, no problem. But that does not mean that 6 months later you're anywhere close to that, right? And so what ends up happening is people who spend a lot have a really big splash at the beginning that just peters out almost immediately. And that's not the kind of readership I want to try to engage. I want to try to engage people that care about stories that really touch them, and that, that hopefully will read more of my writing as I continue to write, assuming it gets better over time. And for those people, billboards don't matter, and banner ads don't matter, and having like a ridiculous social media strategy that just like is cramming it down everyone's throats doesn't work. What I want to engage is the only thing that actually matters for the success of books, which is you want to engage word-of-mouth recommendations. There's literally, that is like the single driving factor. And I know it because I, as a reader, buy books that friends recommend to me, right? Like, it's sort of obvious in a way, right? Like, that's how a lot of people find the books they read. And so the more that you can do to empower people who like your writing to be your ambassadors, right, really, the better you're going to do, I think, right? And so that means, instead of, like, if you go on Twitter, right, you'll see a lot of authors on Twitter, and they'll go, buy my book again, please buy my book, buy my book, right? And that's their whole Twitter stream. And that's really, I don't think it serves them, because first of all, I don't buy books because the author tells me to buy books, right? Like, that comes across sort of like a used car salesman, right? And then and no harm intended to used car salesman, but the second piece that's really important is, if you read that author's book, you might think, this is a really cool book, I'm going to go follow that guy on Twitter so I make sure I don't miss his next book. Right? And like, this equally applies to your mailing list, to anything, right? And if you go on there and this guy is just saying, or this girl is just saying, buy my book, buy my book, buy my book, you're like, I already bought your book. I love your book. I reviewed it on Amazon. It has 5 stars. Like, you're awesome. Give me something more, right? Like, give me something that, as a reader, I want to hear from you. So if you're a new author trying to launch something, like, think about what you can give to your readers, like as a gift, not what you can ask them for.
Yeah, and I think that.
Yeah.
Well, I think that that's such an important point, and I think that it's also such an overlooked point in the entrepreneurial community.
You're right.
Startups act like those authors that just tweet about signing up for my product. Yeah. They don't think about people who. They don't give more than they get. They keep asking, asking instead of giving.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great motto, right? Like, give, ask. Like, if you do that, suddenly, and like, you can actually see it. I mean, I think that you can see it in brands just as well, right? So, like, because that might be relevant to startups. Like, I mean, if you think about like Red Bull, right? Like, they sell caffeinated sugar water, like, it's disgusting, or I don't like it at all, right? Like, it's like not my kind of drink. But like, what we call their marketing is literally them like paying for people to do ridiculous stunts that are fun to watch, right? Like, the highest base jump out of a satellite, right? Just like crazy stuff like that. And so now when they like put a link up, it's to like a guy jumping a motorbike off the Great Wall of China through like a ring of fire into a pit of spikes, right? I mean, it's like, it's this, and you're like, holy crap, like I just want to watch that, right? And the fact that it's like marketing is very secondary. And I think they're very aware of that fact, right? And I think that if startups can think more that way about their own personality, their own public personality as they start to engage with users and customers, and partners as well, and employees too, like that will go a long way for them. And I mean, I think you can see that a little bit, like, you know, Medium, like F. Williams' new startup, like they like, I mean, maybe that's sort of unfair because it's like a very content-oriented play, but like they have also, like a lot of their like marketing is just around them sharing stories that are really compelling, right? And it's like, okay, like that's a lot easier to get behind as a fan, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So back to the writing for a minute. Are you a plotter or a pantser? So if the audience isn't familiar with the term pantser, it's a writer who flies by the seat of their pants, and you know, Stephen King is more of a pantser, and Dan Brown is more of a plotter. So where do you fit?
So I'm pretty firmly on the pantser side. When I started Uncommon Stock, I literally sat down, opened up Word, and started typing. Like I had zero outline. I had yeah, I mean, I don't even have anything to talk about because there wasn't anything, right? It was like I opened up Word, and that was my process. So it got me in trouble later in the book because, you know, I got maybe 2/3 of the way through and had like an identity crisis or existential crisis about the story, like, what the hell am I doing with this? Like, where is this going to go? But I think that for whatever reason, like every writer does things very differently. But for me, it was it allowed me to really engage with the characters and engage with what they were feeling in their present moment, wherever they were in the story and in the scene. And you know what ended up happening, which I found really interesting, is that, you know, partway through writing the book, the characters actually like started making decisions on their own. That like surprised me. I was like, wait a minute, like that is not what I was expecting to happen in this scene, which was weird. I mean, that was just like, that was super strange, right?
Yep.
But that was really interesting. Like I found that to be sort of a bit of a magical moment because it's like, wait a minute, like this has a bit of a life of its own now.
I think that also has an interesting parallel into startups when your users start using your startup in ways you never expected.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a great parallel. No, that makes a lot of sense. And there are some like, I mean, Twitter's a great example of that, right? Like the whole company is based on just this like total side use case.
Yeah, Instagram, same thing. They started out with a product that wasn't as popular, and they saw the images part of their app just blooming. It was amazing, and so they said, you know, let's go with this. I think some first-time authors, when their characters start doing stuff they don't want them to do, they feel like, okay, I've got to control this. You know, my character's got to get back into line. But I think that when you go with it, it really goes more naturally.
Yeah, that's true. I'm trying to experiment with some different, like a different creative approach for my next book, which I'm about 20% through right now. So it's the sequel, Uncommon Stock. And so I tried to, like, I talked to my editor, like, before getting started. I was like, okay, I'm going to be, like, a little more organized and see how this feels. And it didn't really work. Like, once I started writing, I was like, oh, wait a minute, okay, like, this you know, like, I'm sort of back to pantsing. But one thing did help me. And so now I know something that is helpful, at least for my personal creative process, and that is I want to know the ending and I want to know the next scene. So if I know the last scene and the next scene, I'm good. And like that's where I'm most productive. And it doesn't have to be an exact last scene, like I don't have to have the details, it just has to be like a North Star where you're like, okay, I'm imagining a climax that's something like this, right? Like that some of these different plot threads are going to weave together.
Yeah.
And I think that's also true for startups, right? Like it's very easy to overplan. Like the first company I started, I really think we spent like basically most of 6 months like rewriting business plans, and it was just such a waste. Like if we had just like I think 10% of our time was actually productive, and like 90% wasn't. And if we had been able to figure that out then and like only do the 10%, we would have been, like we could have spent the other 90% on a beach or been that much more productive, right?
Yeah.
So.
Totally. I am actually a plotter.
Yeah, let's hear it. I want to hear about your creative process.
Yeah, so it's fascinating because I tried to be a pantser, and in fact, I plotted my book loosely, and I told myself, I've got the plot, I know what happens in my book, but I'm going to go with the characters if they take me elsewhere. So the characters started to take me elsewhere, and it was fascinating because I'm very much not a pantser. Once the characters started going somewhere else, I got lost.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I didn't know what was going to happen, and it kind of stalled. But then what I did is I went with the direction they were going, and I didn't put them in line, but what I did is I just said, okay, you want to go that way, let's redo the outline, redo the plot based on this new twist, and I'm probably going to have to do that 2 or 3 more times.
Sure.
But so it's kind of in between plotting and pantsing, but I kind of need the overall structure to be known for me to make my progress and plan everything. It's fascinating for me. It's so much fun.
It is, yeah, it is. And I think it's really just that element of finding the process that's right for you. And like that actually takes a lot of like sort of introspection, because both of those are equally useful and valid. And like making sure you understand how you work best is really the critical element, right?
Yeah. So what writing apps do you use? Is it just Word, or did you find anything else that was helpful?
So I think that question is pretty interesting. So I use Word for like writing the book, right? Now some people use like Scrivener and like a few other apps for like writing, but that's not how I was thinking about the question. Like my thought on the question is I use Word to actually write the copy, but I often use TextEdit, like if I have like just an idea, right? And I'm like, oh, like I don't want, like I'm not actually writing something, it's just like some concept or something that I want to not forget. So I have always that like open in the background, I'll just like pull it up and like throw something on there. And I like how TextEdit is just like plain text. There aren't like bells and whistles, right? And then the other apps that I've used for writing are sort of funny. Like, well, like one is like Twitter. Twitter is writing, right? And like I use Blogger for my blog, which is also writing. And then the other things that I've used is like Yelp. Like I used Yelp for scenes, because if I'm in a place that I haven't been and I want to take place in a restaurant or a coffee shop or something like that, Yelp is great, right? Like you go on there, there are pictures of the restaurant, they have the menu, they have the location, you have people describing their experiences there, right? So you have sort of everything you need to actually write a scene set wherever the scene is. So I used that during the writing process, which was sort of fun. And Google Maps as well, if you want to make sure that like the geography is consistent and like you're using the right street names or something like that, if it's set in like in the modern world, right? But there are so I feel like there were a lot of different apps that sort of were ancillary but were involved as I was writing the book.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So who inspires you? What writing do you like? Which authors are you reading? What's your inspiration?
So, I think that the writing that I like the best is just like really honest writing. And that doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be nonfiction. Like I think that honesty applies equally to fiction and nonfiction. And to me, that's what makes writing really compelling. It's when you can just feel that the author is sort of bleeding onto the page, right? And that's what I try to achieve in my writing very inexpertly. And that's what I really respect when I read other people's writing. And there are a few people that I love. Like I actually just read Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore this year. It's by Robin Sloan, and he's a writer in San Francisco. And it's got this like magical, ephemeral, almost like fairy tale feel, but it's very much, it like captures the magic that's in San Francisco right now in terms of like startups and that sort of like the tech mentality. There are, I really like if you want like a nice summer read, like Hugh Howey is really fun, and he's sort of the wonderkind of self-publishing. So if you're interested in these new publishing models, he'd be interesting to check out as well. His books they started out as serials, and they're sort of post-apocalyptic, but like oriented to a more adult audience. So it's sort of like a more thoughtful Hunger Games, so like he's really interesting. And I'm actually reading a book right now, and I can't remember the author's name. I could probably check, but the book is called The Dinner, and it's by a Dutch author, Herman Koch. So it's Koch, and it's called The Dinner. And this has to be one of the most interesting books I've read in a long time. It is about a Dutch family going to dinner at a fancy restaurant. So it's like two parents. So it's like a man and his wife, and then the man's brother and his wife, right? So it's like 4 people at a restaurant, and the book takes place over the course of their meal, and it has to be one of the most disturbing, like interesting, compelling psychological thrillers I have read in years.
Wow.
And it's deep, right? Like the characters have the depth of anything in literary fiction, and I think it's amazing. And one of the reasons why I'm really enjoying it is sometimes I feel like the thriller genre, I don't even know if they consider this a thriller. Like if you looked on Amazon, it might be like literary fiction. I don't know, right? But like in the thriller genre, sometimes it's like, oh, like just like Hollywood, can we pack more like sex and like explosions and special effects in, right? And like then people will like it. And like it always comes off as just this sort of like fluff, right? But this is the opposite of that. Like I have not been more like hooked by like weird stuff happening than in this book. And it's, it all takes place in a restaurant. Like it's literally them having a meal.
Wow.
Yeah, so check it out. It's pretty interesting.
That sounds great. So you were originally going to self-publish, and what attracted you to the idea of self-publishing?
So publishing is like in uproar right now, like as an industry, right? So it's sort of like similar to what happened in books, in movies and music like 10 years ago. And now it's happening in publishing, and like the big legacy publishers are, they have great people working for them often, but like especially like the upper management teams generally don't really know what's going on underneath their feet. And so I actually I was never interested in traditional publishing, and in large part that's because of the author experience of traditional publishing. Like you have to send out query letters to like dozens of literary agents and try to pitch them your book, and that takes an enormous amount of time. If you're lucky and one signs you, then you start querying publishers about your book, and if you get lucky, one signs you, and so like that could take a year or two, and then after that, like the editorial process and all this stuff can take a year or two, and like they're just going to launch it whenever it fits their launch timeline, like with their other titles. And like as a first-time author of fiction, like you have no leverage, and so you're just totally at their whim. You have no creative control if they want to change things, and the economics suck. The contracts they offer you, on average, they keep 85% of all revenues, of all royalties. So like any net, and you keep 15. And again, as a first-time author of fiction, nobody gets big advances. If you're Bill Clinton and you write a new book, like you have all the leverage because you have a massive platform and you have a huge name, right? So you can go to them and dictate terms. But if you're a first-time author, forget about it. Like nobody cares. So you're going to get a really small advance followed by really bad economics on the back end, limited creative control, and like very little control about how you engage your audience. So that's why I was wanting to self-publish, because it just gives you, even though you have to be your own project manager and hire these different freelancers, if you take a level of seriousness to the process, you can self-publish with the same production values as a Random House can, right? So that's why I was interested in self-publishing. And I think that actually the distinction now is not between traditionally published and self-published or small press published books. The distinction is between professionally produced books and not professionally produced books, right?
Yeah.
So,
makes sense. But then instead of self-publishing, you decided to go with FG Press. So can you tell us about why you made that choice?
Absolutely. So first of all, I was like totally out of the blue. So I'd been sharing the manuscript for Uncommon Stock with Brad Feld, and Brad is a leading venture capital investor and entrepreneur as well. And he's considered like a thought leader in the startup space, right? So he has a very well-read blog. He's written a number of extremely good nonfiction books about startups. In fact, I highly recommend Venture Deals if you're ever doing early stage financing stuff. Like it's the reference I use. And I've always really loved Brad's writing. He's so honest and genuine on his blog, and his books are just so to the point, and just like share exactly what you need when you need it with the right kind of perspective. So I've always really respected his writing. I've always read his blog. And I shared the initial draft of the manuscript with him to say, hey, you might enjoy this. Like, I'd never met him. I didn't know him at all. And I was like, you might like this. Like, it's set in Boulder. It's about startups. And he was super encouraging. So he actually became a huge inspiration for me throughout that process, just because he was so encouraging, and the depth of his expertise in that industry is just immense. So it was so cool to get his feedback and sort of his pushing as I was getting through the book. And so when I finished the manuscript, the first draft of the manuscript, and I emailed it to him, I had already been lining up my freelancers to, do cover design, do editorial, and he emailed me back and he's like, hey, look, we're interested in starting a new publishing company. Would you be interested in exploring publishing with us? And I was like, holy shit, like this is so cool. Like, this is like a mentor of mine, like a role model professionally, right? Like asking that. And I was like, holy crap, like that sounds amazing. Like, let's talk about it, right? So then he introduced me to Dane McDonald, and Dane is now the CEO of FG Press. And Dane's an awesome guy, just like really gets shit done. And so we started talking about it, and I was really intrigued. And I was intrigued because although the dynamics exist for what I just described as why people should self-publish instead of traditionally publish, that does not mean that there isn't a role for a good publisher, right? Like the funny thing is that like it's wonderful as an author to have a publisher if you're actually on the same team. The trouble is getting on the same team, right? So like they want to build a community of authors, so like an author stable where everybody is super collaborative and working together on manuscripts and sharing best practice and just like being friends with each other. They're setting up their economics completely differently. So instead of it being 85-15 like in traditional publishing, it's 50-50 net, hands down, and there's no advance. And I actually wanted that. I wanted that because it sets up the incentives correctly for me. I don't want to be writing a manuscript for a publisher because they're the ones paying my bills. I want to be writing a story for readers. And the only thing that matters is whether those readers actually engage with it and then share it and purchase it, right? So I want to be incentivized fully to get more readers, and like obviously that's what they want too, right? So it ends up working out quite well. But the more that we explored this, the more that I got excited, because I was like, look, like all those reasons why I didn't want to go to a traditional publisher go out the window, and hell, this is even better than self-publishing. Now I get to like work with a team of people who are awesome, who are excited about the story, and who are going to like bring in other authors that I can collaborate with in future, and all that kind of stuff. So I was really excited, and that's why I ended up signing on with them.
That's awesome. So was it harder than you expected to write the book?
That's a good question. I feel very bipolar about that answer. So like on the one hand, like I went through, as I said, sort of like a number of existential crises like throughout the process of writing it, right? And that's like beyond just having to make time to write it, which is hard enough on its own. But yeah, like I went through different phases where it's like I have no idea what I'm going to do with this, like what where is this going, and all this kind of stuff. So that was really difficult. On the other hand, even though it took a lot of took a lot of work and sweat and pain, it also didn't take as much time as I was expecting it to. I like tracked my time, like not in a detailed way, but just sort of like generally. And I wrote the book over the course of 9 months, but 4 months of that time frame, I was actually out of the country, off grid, no electricity, no internet, and I wasn't writing at all. We were like trekking through the Himalaya, and so it was really only about 4 to 5 months of actual writing time, and then. Obviously this doesn't count like brainstorming, which is quite a bit of the writing process, especially for fiction. But I think I only spent about like 200 hours writing, for the book, which I was surprised by. I thought it would have been much more than that.
So what did you like best about writing?
For me, one of the things that I really like is getting into flow. So it's like, when you're really in the midst of a scene, or you really get into writing a character, suddenly it stops being about the words, and it stops being the sort of your own consciousness of being separate from the task of what you're doing, of actually writing, sort of disintegrated for me. So if I had like a really good writing session, it might be 2 or 3 hours or something, and I would not even be aware of how much time was passing, and just be aware of like being in the midst of what I was doing. And for me, that was really powerful. And like I've had similar experiences if you're like running or surfing or whatever. Like there are other ways that you can experience flow. But I really enjoyed that with writing. And the other half of it is just being creative. Like a lot of my previous work had been like in startups was more analytical and more business oriented, just like and relationship oriented as well, which I love. Like I love that kind of work, but it was really fun to go back to basically like finger painting, right? Like which I've done forever, right? Like that almost just seems ridiculous, but it was like, heck, this is like totally greenfield. Like I'm just sitting here in front of Word. It's just as easy for me to like write about someone's commute to work as it is to write about a dragon invading San Francisco, right? I mean, like it's just words on a page. So I found that really, really cool and really inspiring. And it's actually played out, like, I feel like it plays back and forth a lot with my advising work, because I consult with startups and some tech companies. And when I do that, it's actually like enormously useful to think about business problems from the point of view of like writing a scene of fiction, right? Because it's like, you have to come up with it, like it all has to be like forward looking, and you have to be creating the world for whatever product it is to exist in.
That's awesome. I love that. So thank you for your time. Just one more question. For fans of Uncommon Stock, what's next for Mara? Is it dragons?
No dragons in Uncommon Stock, but yeah, no, I'm about 20% of the way through book 2. So Mara is actually going to Burning Man. So that'll be quite fun. So no dragons, but there's definitely some excitement there to get involved with. But yeah, they're continuing to build Mosaic, and as you can imagine, they're continuing to get wrapped more deeply into the sort of crazy stuff that's going on behind the scenes in terms of money laundering and cryptocurrency and all that kind of stuff. So it's the next roller coaster ride for her. Stuff is only going downhill, and she's going to Burning Man.
Well, I really appreciate your time, and let's have you on and talk some more when your next book comes out.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for doing this, Lucas. I can't wait to read your book. So please keep me on the early read list for it. It's definitely.
Will do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Have a great day.
You too.